Welcome to Biome Box, where you can learn about biomes all across the world. Today's episode is on the kelp forest, a very interesting aquatic biome found in the ocean on the coast of many places around the world, in every continent other than Antarctica. In a kelp forest, you can see the otters, crabs, sea urchins, and strands of wonderful kelp, and feel the soft otter's fur and tough gel-like texture of the kelp around you. You can smell the fish and taste the salt of the water around you. And if you're adventurous enough to take a bite out of the kelp, you can taste its brine-like flavor. You can even hear the ambient sounds of the surrounding animals, such as otters. If we take a closer look at the otter, you can see how it affects its surrounding ecosystem in the kelp forest. Sea otters are one of the most important creatures in the kelp forest ecosystem, keeping the population of sea urchins in check, which helps the kelp. There are, of course, individual sea otters, but they make up a population of sea otters. These sea otters interact with organisms directly around them, such as kelp, which forms a community. If we look at species even further out, this forms an ecosystem. And if we consider the impact of these simple sea otters on the whole area of this kelp forest, that creates the kelp forest biome. Finally, that biome's interactions with areas around the world creates the whole biosphere. The kelp forest also includes several factors, abiotic and biotic. In other words, both living and non-living things affect the kelp forest. An example of some living things are otters, kelp, and sea urchins. Some abiotic factors are the sand that provides a base for the kelp and bottom-walking creatures, the rocks that provide shape to the biome, and the water that allows for survival of the kelp and other biotic factors. On screen now is a simple kelp forest food web. As you can see, most, if not all, of the energy in a kelp forest comes from the primary productivity of the kelp. The kelp is often eaten by the kelp crabs and sea urchins. Both of these creatures are eaten by sea otters. Kelp has adapted to the rocky sands of the coasts, where they are found by developing the holdfast system, where they latch onto rocks to grow. Some sea urchins have also adapted to eat the fallen fronds of kelp instead of the actual plants, so the kelp can keep producing food for them. Another example of a plant adapting is a plant called acid seaweed that has adapted an acid defense mechanism to prevent overgrazing. Finally, an animal with an adaptation is the sea otter. They wrap themselves in kelp blankets when they sleep so they do not drift away. One example of competition for resources is the competition between kelp crabs and sea urchins for kelp. Both of them has kelp as one of their only food sources, so naturally when one of them overgrazes on the kelp, the other species fails. With sea otters, overpopulation can lead to competition for mates and for food. The denser a population is, the more contest there will be for resources. The main keystone species of a kelp forest is the sea otter, which is the predator to a kelp crab and has prey as a sea urchin. The kelp crab also feasts on kelp, which in a way is its prey. A symbiotic relationship is a relationship between multiple organisms. They can be mutualism relationships, commensalism relationships, and parasitism relationships. An example of a mutualism relationship is between kelp and sea otters. They help each other because sea otters eat sea urchins and kelp provides energy to the otters. Sea otters and kelp are also an example of a commensalism relationship, as sea otters use kelp to anchor themselves, and sea otters have no benefit or deficit to the kelp in another way. An example of a parasitic relationship is that between the sea urchin and the kelp, as sea urchins leech off of kelp, with kelp being hurt by this. Otters innately know how to swim and are generally playful creatures. However, otters learn to spin and swim better, as well as cleaning their fur. An invasive species being added to a kelp forest would completely upset the balance of the ecosystem. This could lead to the destruction of kelp and too much competition for otters. Climate change would lead to kelp forests dying out as well, as it would create problems with oceans becoming too warm to support the forests. Kelp forests also cannot survive in deep water, so the rising water level would be a problem. Kelp forests don't have a population of humans, but if humans were introduced, it would likely lead to the destruction of kelp forests, as they would be an invasive species. If sea otters went extinct, there would be vast overgrazing of kelp, as nothing would keep the crab and urchin populations in check. That was Biome Box, everybody. Thank you for listening. We'll be back with another episode next week. Signing off.